In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the knock sensors in this Toyota 4Runner. This is going to be located underneath the lower intake. Let's get into it. Underneath the vehicle, we're going to take this shield down using a 13mm socket. Take the bolts out. There's two in the front. I'm going to slide the front part back and try to slide it down. There's a couple clips holding it in. And the back part is going to slide forward. Right here, there is a drain on the radiator. If your radiator doesn't have a drain right there, you want to pop off the coolant hose. Make sure you have a drain bucket underneath. Just loosen up this drain. And just drain the coolant out. We're going to disconnect the battery, the negative terminal. Use a 10mm wrench. Loosen up the nut. And slide it off and out of the way. Disconnect the mass airflow sensor. There's just a little push tab. Just push that down. Slide the connector off. Just pop this retainer off right here. You can use some needle nose pliers. Just squeeze the tabs. That slides off, out of the way. There's another retainer right here. This one's broken. Just pull that aside as well. And over here, there's a retainer. And pop that off. Pop this hose out of the bracket right there. There's another hose right here. Just use some hose pliers. And just slide this off, just like that, out of the way. There's a hose up top. You can use some hose pliers. Just wiggle that back and forth. Slide that off. Set that aside. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to loosen up the worm clamps. That one there and right here. Just grab the snorkel. Slide it off the throttle body and slide it off the mass airflow sensor. I'll just grab this hose. I'm just using some hose pliers. Just twist it and it slides right off. Disconnect the connector right here. Just push down on the tab. Slide the connector off. There's another connector over here. Push down on the tab and slide it off. Just going to use some pliers just to squeeze that. Slide that off. There's a connector down below here. Push down on the tab and slide that one off. Take this hose off right here. Just slide it down. If you need to, you can use pliers. Push that out of the way. All right, this hose right here, I'm just going to pull this out of this bracket. You might have to bend the bracket just slightly. Slide that out. And we have the cable that goes to the throttle body. Slide that out of the bracket. And there's a bracket right here. We want to take that bolt out. Using a 14mm socket. Now slide the cable off. Slide the end out. And set that aside. I'm going to take this hose off. I'm just going to use some hose clamp pliers. Squeeze that. And using some hose pliers, twist this back and forth and slide it off. Now we're going to take this bracket off that's connected to this line right here. That's the throttle cable line. Use a 10mm socket. Loosen that up. Take that bolt out right there, and then that can be set aside. Take this ground wire right here off. We're going to use a 10mm socket. Loosen that up. Take that off. We're going to pop this diagnostic connector off. I'm just going to use a pick, and there's a little tab in there. Slide back on that tab, and that slides up. That's the tab right there. Just set that aside. This hose that runs along the back, just pop that out of the bracket. Set that aside. Now we're going to loosen up the bolts and nuts for the intake manifold. We'll start over here using a 12mm socket. Just crack them free first. That's all of them. Grab the manifold. I'm just going to tip it up, and over here, there is a hose for the PCV. Just pop that off. You can twist this out of the way so I don't have to disconnect the coolant hoses that go to the throttle body. Take this gasket off, just slide it off. You don't want to drop anything in there, so be careful. To prevent anything from falling in there, I'm just going to take some rags. I'll stuff it in there. You just need to remember to remove the rags before we put this back together. I'm going to clean up this gasket material. You can use a scraper or a razor blade, just be careful. Try to scrape away from the center where the holes are. And just take a rag and some brake parts cleaner and just clean this up a little bit. This hose right here and tube, we're going to take that off. Use a 12mm socket. Take the two bolts off for the brackets. Just going to use a 12mm wrench. Loosen this one up. You can take it out by hand. Grab the hose, just slide it to the side. In the back there's a bracket that's connected to the lower intake. Use a 10mm wrench, loosen that up. Take that off, that's separated. Underneath there's a hose that's attached to a bracket. You got to take those two bolts out. You're going to use a 10mm socket. Just move some of the other hoses out of the way. Alright, those are off. Now take this bolt off. Use a 12mm socket. Loosen that up. Alright, and that bracket's separated. There's some bolts we're going to take out on this side of the intake. Use a 12mm socket. There's a nut on the side here. Loosen that up. Just loosen them all first. Take the nut off. Grab the intake. Slide it up. And it slides right up. I'm going to loosen up this worm clamp using a 8mm socket. Slide that down and grab the hose. Just twist twist it back and forth, slide it off and out of the way. And we're going to take this part of the timing cover off, use a 10mm socket, take the bolts out. Some bolts down below, take those out. There's one more down below. Loosen that one up and take that one out. And get that bolt out. Just pop this wire connector out, just using a trim tool. There's a wire retainer right here. I'm just going to use some needle nose pliers, just squeeze that. You should be able to pop this out. Just like that. Just grab the cover, slide it out. On the bottom of the throttle body, we're going to take these two hoses off. Just use some hose clamp pliers. Slide the clamps down. I'm just using some hose pliers. Loosen these up. You can use regular pliers, just be careful not to squeeze it too much. Slide those off. And slide that off. Now just grab this upper intake and pull it out of the way. These two wiring harnesses on both sides, we're going to take those off. Use a 10mm socket. Slide that back. Disconnect the fuel injectors. Just push down on the tab. And slide that up. Do the same on the other ones. I'm just going to plug up the holes with some rags so nothing falls down in there. We're going to take the nuts and the bolts out of the lower intake. I'm going to use a 12mm socket. I'll just loosen them all up first. And this back one I can't get to. I'm going to have to use a swivel socket on the back one. There's two connectors on the front. We'll disconnect those. Just going to use a pick. Just push down on the tab. There we go. Slide those to the side. Just going to move the wiring harnesses out of the way. I'll disconnect them on the coils. The wiring harnesses in the front go way down, so I'm not going to disconnect any of that stuff, but just try to slide it out of the way. And we'll go back here as well. You can just slide it kind of out of the way. So before we do that, there's a coolant temp sensor connector. I'm going to disconnect that. And I'm going to grab the intake, slide it up. There we go. And we could just slide this out of the way. The fuel rail is still attached. If you wanted to take the intake off completely and take it out of the way, you want to disconnect the two fuel lines on the side. I'm just going to use a hose clamp, pliers, slide that hose clamp down. And you can loosen up this hose right here. Grab the hose, just give it a twist a little bit. Just using some hose pliers. You could use regular pliers if you don't have them. And slide the return hose off. Just be careful, there might be a little bit of pressure in there. And then if you follow the other fuel line back, you can see we're going to disconnect it right here. And using a 14mm line wrench and a 19mm wrench, loosen up the fitting right here. Again, you might have a little bit of fuel. Just be careful in case there's any pressure in there. And slide the line off. And we're going to disconnect this coolant hose as well. There's a little clamp right here. Slide that off and then twist it back and forth. And everything should be disconnected. Slide it under the harness. And it comes right off. Before we take the gaskets off, there's a lot of dirt and debris in here. I'm going to clean that up with a vacuum. Take the gaskets off, slide those up, out of the way. Like that. You can see the wiring harness right here. You want to disconnect the connector and just push down on the tab and slide it off. You might need some pliers to do this. Slide that connector off. You can disconnect the other connector as well and slide that harness out of the way. I'm using a 1 1/16 size socket. I'll slide it over the knock sensor. It's a little bit tight in there. And loosen it up. Once you get it loose, you should be able to do it by hand. Just pull this off. And slide the knock sensor out. Take the new knock sensor, line it up. Put the socket over. And we're going to torque that to 29 foot-pounds. And then you can do the same with the other one. Now take the wiring harness, line that up, connect the connector, make sure it's locked in good. Do the same on the other one. Those are both locked in. And if you popped this out right here, you want to re-secure that down. Now you can use a scraper or a razor blade. Be careful if you use a razor blade. And just clean up the gasket area if there's any corrosion. Take a rag with some brake parts cleaner and just clean up those areas that the gasket is going to sit. Just making sure you don't get any debris in the holes. Take some compressed air and just where the valves are, just blow it out. Make sure nothing fell in there. Now take the gaskets, line these up, go over the studs with the gaskets. It's easiest to slide the gaskets for the top, almost have the gaskets upside down first. Then you can slide it over the stud and drop it down, just like that. Now I'm going to take the stud that came out and reposition that, put that back in, so that will hold the gasket in place. Otherwise it could slip down while we're trying to install the intake. So get that on. I'm just using some locking pliers just to snug this down. Just make sure you don't tighten on where the threads are if you had to do this. Now with the lower intake, we'll just take a razor blade and just clean this all up. Just like on the engine, just clean any of the gasket material or carbon buildup. And take a rag with some brake parts cleaner and just wipe it down. Slide the intake in place, slide the fuel lines underneath. Same with this coolant line. Go under that wiring harness. That's all lined up. That looks good there. Before I put all the bolts and nuts on, I'm going to attach the fuel lines. And attach the fuel line. This fuel hose, the return line. Move the clamp back. If the clamp seems loose, you want to put a new clamp on. And we'll tighten this one down. And snug that down. You want to double check this later. If it's leaking, you want to tighten it up some more. Now we'll take the bolts. The shorter bolts are going to go further out. Make sure you have the washers as well. And the longer bolts are going to go more towards the center. So get those started. Get those all in. And all the washers are going to go over the studs. And put the nuts on. Starting with the center and just snugging these down first. Now we're going to torque these bolts to 13 foot-pounds. And you want to torque the nuts to the same 13 foot-pounds. Then you can go around again, just double check. Make sure everything's torqued because the center ones will be a little bit loose. Take this bracket, line that up, get the bolts in. Tighten those down. On the back of the wiring harness, connect the connector for that coolant sensor. Just lock it down, push down the wiring harness and the coolant hose. Line this up. Slide that over. This little clip right here, you can slide that over that wiring harness. And move the hose clamp. Connect these connectors, lock those in place, connect all the fuel injectors, lock those down, slide this cover in place. Take that hose out of the way. Make sure you're not going to pinch any wires or hoses. That slides in position like that. Get all the bolts started. And those bolts are all in. Now I can snug those all down. And re-secure the harness right there. Put the coolant hose on. Line that up. Put the worm clamp in place and we'll tighten that down. Just snug that down, that's good. Install this hose. Slide it in position. Take this bracket, slide this in position, and get the bolt started. And I'll snug this down. You can tighten it up later once it's attached up top. Take the gasket off the lower intake, just slide it up. Just going to use a razor blade just to clean up any gasket material. You can use a scraper. Just going to use a little compressed air. And just take a rag with some brake parts cleaner and just wipe it down. That's good. At this point, I'll take these rags out. Just make sure no debris falls in there. Just take some compressed air. That's good. Take the gasket, line it up, slide it in position. Now I'm going to take a scraper or a razor blade and just clean up the gasket material on this middle intake. And take a rag, the little brake parts cleaner, and just wipe off any debris. That's good. And then you can do the same on the other side. We're going to do the same with the upper. Just scrape the gasket material off. And clean it up. Now take the intake, make sure some of the hoses are out of the way. Line these up, make sure it's lined up on the studs. Make sure all your hoses are at least going in the right direction. Now we can put the bolts back in. Now snug these down. And torque those bolts to 13 foot-pounds. Now this bracket underneath here, I'll attach that, put the two bolts in. Tighten that down. Snug. Same with the other bolt. Now we can slide this connector right here, and this ground strap is going to go right here. Get that started and snug that down. And put the bolt in this bracket. Get that started. Take the back bolt, slide it through where the wiring harness goes on the back side here. Get that started. Snug that down. Now these two bolts for the bracket. Tighten those down. Take the rags out of here. Just make sure no debris falls in there. Put the gasket on. There should be a stud on this one. Put the stud in there. That's good. Take the upper intake, line this up. And the studs are gonna go right there. Line the hoses up. It's for the PCV, and then the coolant hoses. If you took those off, you would put those back on. That's good. Get the bolts in. And the two nuts on the studs. Yep, snug those down. Torque these to 13 foot-pounds. Slide this hose over here. Use the hose pliers, move that down. Take this bracket, line that up, and put the bolt in. Tighten that down. And slide this into the bracket right here. That's the throttle cable. Goes right there. Take the cable, slide it in position. Push it in. And get that lined up. Line the bracket up. Put the bolt in. Tighten that down. Connect the connectors. This hose, we'll slide this hose right on here. The other connector, lock that in place. There's a connector down here. Plug that in. Take the snorkel, line it up. That's good. There's a hose up here. I'm gonna line that up. Push that on. Make sure it's in the bracket. There's a hose right here. Slide that tube on. Tighten down the worm clamps. This hose right here, it's gonna go right there. Connector, line the connector up. Plug it in. If this retainer was in somewhere, you want to plug that back in. Right there. This should go right here. And it goes right there. Now connect the negative terminal and tighten it down. And snug it up. We'll put the drain plug for the radiator back in. And snug that down. Now take the shield, slide it in the middle, in the back. It's got a clip on there. Clip it on the front. Right there. Get the bolt started. And put the other two bolts in. And snug these all down. Now we're going to add the coolant. Take the radiator cap off, just twist to the left, slide that off. Now I'm going to use a funnel to add the coolant. You don't have to use a funnel, but it helps. Now we're going to add the appropriate coolant, a 50-50 mix. After it's all full, you can take the funnel off, put the cap on, make sure the reservoir has plenty of coolant in it, and run the vehicle for about 15 to 20 minutes, constantly monitoring, make sure the engine is not overheating. After that, shut it down, let it cool, and double check your level.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.